litigation, injunctions, emergency court dates, depositions, trials, postponements. It is all encompassing. It will swallow you whole if you let it. Back in law school, dean of students, she said, in 3 years, we're going to have reprogrammed your entire brain to think like lawyers. And I remember thinking, okay, I don't know what that means, but sounds great.
Tell us the best piece of advice you ever received, Matt.
90% of being a good dad or parent is just showing up, just letting your kids know that you're there. My son playing football, Pop Warner football a few years ago, and I was at a game, and like everybody else, my phone is glued to my hand, and I look down, and all of a sudden, everyone in the benches for my son's team started cheering, and the one dad started patting me on the back, and he's like, "Did you see what Luca did?" I missed, at the time, what was the best play of his career.
How do GCs view IP versus the CEOs?
A CEO views it as a commodity, like a bar of gold. And I view it as a nest with eggs in it.
If you had to advise a younger Matt who's 28-year-old, what advice would you give him?
As a lawyer or just as a human being? Had we done this a year ago, who knows? It may have been the worst podcast guest you've ever had.
Matthew Campobasso, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here. It's been great getting prepared for this, and I've been excited to chat with you all week. So glad we're getting started.
Brilliant. Matt, I saw your beautiful journey, how you're juggling between being a father, a writer, a podcast host, a chief legal officer at Zone. And tell me about it. Tell me how do you juggle between so many roles, and what do you enjoy the most and what do you not like too much?
So I do a lot, as you just mentioned. I don't think you mentioned professor. I also teach at a law school in Chicago. I get bored easily. I think that's one thing. And not bored in the sense that, I expect somebody to entertain me, but my brain's always going. I think part of that is, probably a lot of lawyers listening can relate. Our brains are analytical. They're usually always on. And so I kind of feel as though if I'm awake, if I'm standing up, if I'm walking around, if I'm sitting up, I more or less should be doing something to learn, to contribute to the world, to create. And so much of my career and so much of the last 20 years of practicing for me have been being a lawyer and being a dad. I have 3 kids. My oldest is 16. So I've been a lawyer for a few years longer. And so as my kids have gotten older and as I've kind of, I think, smoothed into knowing the gear that I need to be in for my career right now, I find myself with additional time. And, I could sit around and binge Netflix, or I could, go to bed early. I do go to bed early sometimes, but I love to explore. I love to dig into things and learn, push myself. A lot of people will tell me, aren't you afraid of like failing or falling down? And I say, not really. I don't care at this point. I've fallen down enough in my life to where I don't have that particular fear. And so I'll usually pick something up, whether it's a podcast, starting to write a book, considering, teaching a law school class, which I had never done prior to this year. And if I'm not good at it, I'll get better. And if I don't like it, if it's not something that, excites me, then I'll probably set it down and try to find something that does excite me. So I think it's my innate desire to continue to evolve. I tell my kids, they're all at the age where I think school-aged kids are very competitive, and there's a lot of, he's faster, she jumps higher, he can throw a football spiral better. And I tell my kids, the only person you're competing with is yourself yesterday. And so be a little bit better today than yesterday, and so on. And that's kind of been my driving focus in my life, just trying to, I don't do these things for, clicks or accolades or people saying, wow, you wrote a book. It's for myself. And so I've told people, if I wrote this book or started this podcast and no one ever read a page or listened to an episode, it doesn't matter. It's helping me evolve as a person. And I've learned a lot about myself. And so I think it's that I have a growth mindset. And I think I can't see myself, if I'm lucky to live to 100, the next 53 years of my life will be more of the same. Maybe not all the same things, but I'll keep looking and kind of reaching for new undiscovered things that excite me.
Beautiful. That's a beautiful way to live a life, Matt. Really inspiring. You also spoke about your book. What inspired you to write this book? And tell us about the most important chapter in the book.
So what inspired me to write the book, I guess I'll tell you a little bit about what the book is so the inspiration can connect those threads. The book is called The Case for Letting Go, and it's written as a lawyer by a lawyer. And the idea is I set out to write a book that I wish somebody had handed me 20 years ago, because while the practice of law has been incredibly rewarding personally and professionally, financially, it's how I support my family, it's challenging. And it's one of those things that can be all consuming if you let it. And a lot of it has to do with, and I really reflected over the last 20 years of my career in writing the book. And I remember back in law school, the first day, the dean of students, she said, in 3 years, we're going to have reprogrammed your entire brain to think like lawyers. And I remember thinking, okay, I don't know what that means, but sounds great. And sure enough, you read case law for 3 years, you become equipped to issue spot, to analyze, to draw conclusions, to pull out rules. And sure enough, after 3 years, I was wired to think like a lawyer. Now, the problem is I am a lawyer, as my career, but I'm also a son and a brother and a dad and a partner. And I do a lot of other things that are not lawyer centric, but I have to do it with the same brain. And that leads to people often telling me, could you just not be a lawyer for a second? And I'm sure we'll talk more about that and what that means. I'm sure you've had that experience as well. But I said to myself about a year ago, I want to step back and think about, how do I show up in my life in a way that's more human than it is lawyer? And also, how do you navigate the stresses and the complexities and the demands of being a lawyer? And that's where this book came from. That was the inspiration. Like I said, I wrote it for myself 20 years ago, and hopefully it gets into the hands of some people who can read it and take some things away. And there's some lessons that are learned the easy way, right? The hard way is you fall on your face, you get up, and you've learned your lesson. The easy way is somebody tells you, hey, here's something you should know, and you listen. And so as far as the most important chapter, that's a great question. We're actually in the process of finalizing the manuscript right now. And so some things are moving around, but there's a chapter that I wrote, and it's about my son playing football, Pop Warner football, a few years ago. And I was at a game, and like everybody else, my phone is glued to my hand. And if it haptics or it dings, I look down. It's Pavlovian. And it just so happened that I'm sitting in the stands. I made the game. I've never missed a game or any of my kids' events or practices. And I look down, and all of a sudden, everybody in the benches for my son's team started cheering. And the one dad started patting me on the back, and he's like, "Did you see what Luca did?" Luca's my son. And I was mortified. I was like, and I said, "Oh yeah, I did. Yeah." I was embarrassed. And he's like, "That was unbelievable. That was the best play of the season, blah, 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 blah." And I couldn't tell you what I looked at my phone for, if it was a message for something that was quote unquote urgent, but I can definitely tell you that I missed at the time what was the best play of his career. Thankfully, he's continued to play, and he's had a lot of other great plays that I have seen. But that part hurt me. Then walking to the car with my son after the game, he was excited, and he kept saying, "And did you see that?" And I lied to him. I said, "I did. That was amazing." And I just thought, like, it's my shortcoming here in that moment should not rain on his parade. And so I have since acknowledged to him that I didn't see the play, because I figured at some point he might read this book, and I'd rather have him hear it from me. But there's a chapter in there about that, and it's about being present, and it's about drawing lines between your personal life and your professional life that allow you to show up and be the best lawyer you can be, but also not at the expense of cannibalizing those moments with your kids. I read something the other day that said, in 20 years, the only people who will know whether you worked late are your kids. Your manager doesn't care, your colleagues don't care, your team doesn't care. Doesn't mean I dial it in. I don't. I can't. I'm not built that way. But I do think about that, and I need to be present. And so that was part of reflecting on those things, as part of what brought me to write the book. And that's one of the first chapters. And I give some tools about how I have learned to keep those lines clear when I'm, quote unquote, off the clock, so that I don't miss the next great thing that one of my kids does.
Beautiful. Beautiful. This is really empowering. Beautiful story, Matt. Matt, since we're talking about this, I have a very relevant question here as well. Because talking about sacrificing in our lives, lawyers also are built to work very hard, especially in the US. We have like very high ethics, also because they're very high paying jobs. They're charging $2,000, $3,000 per hour. And so there's a
Yes.
moral obligation to work hard and be always present for the client. Even though you're not present for your family, but you're present for your client. You're always there for your client. So the question here is, do lawyers pay too much for their money?
I think so. I think on balance, the profession as a whole does. And I'm sure there are lawyers who figured it out before they started practicing and they kept those lines in place. But as a profession, I do think that lawyers are told collectively just by the way that other lawyers show up, and that if you have to pull out all the stops, you have to be available, you have to be on call. I was a litigator for 11 years. Litigation, injunctions, emergency court dates, depositions, trials, postponements. It is all encompassing, and it will swallow you whole if you let it. I found that that was my experience, and because I think a lot of lawyers are type A, not all lawyers, but a lot of lawyers are type A. You want to be the best, and so if you're looking around and everybody else is working 10, 12, 14-hour days, and you feel like I have to do that just to keep up, then that creates a kind of a vicious flywheel that I think, to your point, lawyers pay too much for their salary and their compensation and their money. It's just, and it's hard. It's an ongoing battle. There's no one quick fix for it. I've talked to so many lawyers about, hey, you seem to have balance. How did you get there? And maybe it was a health scare. Maybe it was the ending of a relationship. Maybe it was something significant that kind of took them and shook them back into reality and said, hey, what are you doing? But I think lawyers, we kind of get pulled into this slipstream that other lawyers exist in, and we compare ourselves. And not only is comparison the enemy of joy, but if you're a type A person who's ultimately driven to be successful, there's always a higher mountain to climb, and you always look over and somebody else is climbing it. And so it is, I can't place the blame at the feet of one lawyer or one group of lawyers or one law firm. I think it is institutional in the profession. And I think the hope is, for me at least, this book might reach a few people and help them realize, hey, slow down. You can be a good lawyer, have a balanced life, and not lose your sanity. So
Absolutely. So tell us about this thing. One important question here. How has your relationship with money evolved over time?
that's a great question. I will absolutely answer it, but I'll share something. I have been, I was raised with two parents that definitely educated me around money and what it means and what it does and how it's a tool. And I think at some point, probably like most teenage boys, I kind of just stopped listening, and I was like, I'll take it from here. And so, I've always considered myself financially responsible, but I think my education in that realm really slowed down until I reached my 40s. And some of the books that are on the shelf here over my shoulder are learning on things that fill that gap. And so, what I've tried to do is to understand that money is, like I said, it's a tool. It helps you, it can either satisfy needs or wants, and it's finite, for almost 99.9% of the world's population. And you have to be selective. And I think having a healthy relationship with it and respecting it, not valorizing it, not worshiping it, that's where I think people get concerned. You have to appreciate it for what it is. And it is a degree of freedom. So this year, at the end of 2025, and I was just talking about this on my podcast, at the end of 2025, I was reading a book on money, financial literacy. And I decided that 2026 was going to be the year that I sat down and educated all three of my kids in an age appropriate way. My kids are 7 and 12 and 16, about money management. And so I actually created, probably the professor in me, I created a syllabus essentially, which is 52 weeks of lessons. And every week, one of them, they each get an assignment that's age appropriate, and it teaches them a theme. And the theme's always the same, so we can talk about it collectively. But one of the first weeks was, a list. I want you to list the things in your life that you need and differentiate them from the things that you want. And think about, if you have $1, where do you spend that and why? And again, it's not about not spending money on things. It's not about, again, valorizing money. It's just about being cognizant of how you use it and deliberate. And so I hope that answers your question, but it's actually it's apt that you're asking because it's really been something that's been on my mind. And again, not because I worship money, I don't, but I do respect it, and I think that relationship with it is important. And so I'm trying to distill that on my kids and hope that again they learn some lessons conceptually that I learned the hard way.
Absolutely, and the best way to learn something is to teach it. So there are I learned somebody that you if you want to learn something, learn it, teach it, and implement it. That's how you learn it. Learn it. There are
Yes.
three steps to learning.
Yes, implementing is so important. Actually sitting down and putting pen to paper on how does this work? I got to make this work because it reveals bugs. That's how, my company, my last company were software companies. And I remember talking to product managers and developers and they would say, you have a vision, you have a demo, but you don't really start to understand where the weaknesses are until you ship it. And then you start getting clients calling you saying, "Hey, this doesn't do what I thought." And obviously you iterate there and the goal is to ship things in a final usable format, but humans are fallible, so that's not always the case.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tell us one thing, Matt. How do good lawyers become great general counsels?
So that assumes I'm a great general counsel, and I don't know if that's the case. I try to be. I think I have things that I'm good at, but from my perspective, in my humble opinion, it's exposing yourself to things that make you uncomfortable. And by that, I mean new issues, things that you don't have a quick solve for. I think as a young lawyer, I was always either taught or I observed and assumed that I had to be able to answer every question in the room. And as a result, there's only so much you can learn over time. And so, as a finite amount of time, you become proficient in certain things, you become a subject matter expert. And at a law firm, that's okay because when somebody calls a law firm and they want an IP lawyer or they want a litigator or a transactional attorney, the expectation is I'm paying $1,000 an hour for somebody. This is all they do. This is all they think about. And so I'm in safe hands. It's like going to the hospital and needing brain surgery, right? You want a brain surgeon. And so when I became an in-house lawyer about 7 years ago, I started my journey 8 years ago. I realized a lot of people said to me, do you know how to do that? And my answer was no, but I know enough about what I know to where I'll figure the other stuff out in real time. And so I threw myself into the things that were scary, that were unknown. I read books, I did research. I decided that just because I had done something as a litigator for 11 years, that I was allowed to want to be more. And so a big belief of mine, and it's something that I teach my teams. I have a great team at Zone. I had a great team at my last company, Infusion, is especially as an in-house lawyer. And to your question, I think as a general counsel, it's not about being the foremost expert on SEC compliance or M&A or antitrust. It's about range. It's about being a generalist. And I think that has been my greatest tool as an in-house lawyer is I can issue spot and I can do most things pretty well. There's some things I do that I'm really good at. There's some things that I'm learning, and there's things that I sometimes come to me and I'm like, I don't know how to approach this. And I research and I talk to our outside counsel. But I think that going from a good lawyer at a law firm or even a good in-house lawyer who maybe specializes in one area, if you want to go become a general counsel, get those reps and try to do it in a way where you are in an environment where the people who can give you those reps, there's a level of protection, so you're not harming the company if you fall on your face. But it's all about exposure. And I will say that everybody, when I left law firm practice, I was a partner, and everybody was like, "You're crazy. You just made partner 2.5 years ago. What are you doing?" And I said, I'm being drawn to different practice areas. And now, everybody looks back and says, what a great plan. Like you really nailed it. And I tell them, I have doubted myself so frequently over the last 8 years, not doubted my ability, but doubted whether I made the right decision and whether the opportunities and my skill set and my desires were going to come together to give me a chance. And I've been very fortunate. I've had some amazing mentors, but I think, it takes a village is true when it comes to raising kids. And I also think it takes a village to, when you look back, create a great general counsel. You've got to have mentors. You've got to have exposure. You have to have opportunities.
Tell us about one thing. You transitioned from being a litigator to a general counsel. Why should a younger lawyer think about this path?
So I will tell you, I when I first became a general counsel 7 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, a lot of people looked at me and said, litigators, that I don't see the journey. I see corporate lawyer or transactional lawyer or M&A lawyer or securities lawyer, but litigators. And what I told people was it came down to two things. One was getting an opportunity, a company to look at me and say, you know what, we're going to look past the label of litigator and we're going to talk about this whole person. What are his strengths and weaknesses as a professional, not just a lawyer. And I'll tell you, I sent out hundreds of resumes. I had so many interviews, and it was no after no after no after no. And if there's one thing that I am, it's stubborn. And I just was like, I'm going to find the right job, and when I have that opportunity, I'm gonna give it everything. And the way that I ended up pitching myself, and why I actually think companies should look at litigators, like law firm litigators, to come in as in-house attorneys, is because if I grew up in a law firm and I draft contracts all day, a lot of that is conceptual. And that's not a criticism of transactional lawyers, but those are ideas. And we've been talking so far about lessons, right? There's ideas, there's lessons you hear about, and there's lessons you learn from the pain. Litigators are constantly dealing with the realized pain. A contract was not drafted well. A company decided, I don't have money to hire a lawyer. I'm just going to draft this myself or pull something off the internet. That is a risk that's just ticking until there's a lawsuit and a company's like, I am going to go out of business if I lose this. And I stood in front of juries and I sat in depositions and I explained to jurors this sentence. This is why you have to fine for my client to the tune of $15 million. And so I think to be able to issue spot and understand what actualized pain looks like from a risk perspective is like the single biggest skill that I have. Because I think about, hey, if this all burns down, what does this look like at that last line, at that last yard line before the end zone? And that is something litigators do because you're living in the trenches. Litigators, I often refer to them as hired guns. They parachute in when
And
everything's on fire.
where's the money, Matt? In litigation, or in being a GC? Where's the money?
I think it's in both. I think it depends on where I mean, there are, and also I think it's relevant. It's a relevant question to ask is, when you say the money, is it $1 million a year? Is it $10 million a year? Is it a few $100,000 a year? I know lawyers who are solo practitioners that do really well, 7 figures a year. I know lawyers who are in-house attorneys for public companies who do 7 figures a year between equity and bonuses. I also know law firm lawyers who do $1 million a year because of their origination. I also know lawyers in all three of those environments that, make $150,000 a year. And so I think part of it is, careers are long if we're lucky. And if you're a lawyer for 40 years, the money will come, I think. What I would suggest to people is follow your heart and go towards the things that excite you, because it is a tedious existence to be a lawyer, right? It requires, you kind of have to always be on. And if you're doing something as a lawyer that you don't enjoy, or at least get intellectually stimulated by, 40 years is going to feel like 400 years. And no amount of money is going to cure that. You think about, the really big law firms that are starting to pay $180,000, $190,000 to first year lawyers. I do nothing as a first year lawyer. I remember my first law firm job, my billable rate was like $450. And I remember thinking, someone's paying $450 for me? Like, I don't know anything. And so there's a reason law firms pay that money, because they drown you in work. It's hazard pay. And so I think it's a different path for every person. The money it's everywhere. It's not everywhere, but it's all different paths. There's a version of that has a pot of gold at the end of it. And so my recommendation would be, don't follow the money, follow the passion, and then figure out a way to make it economically advantageous.
Brilliant. One question about your career in the past, law experience. So I've learned that mistakes don't define us; they refine us. What mistakes did you make in the past we all can learn from? The younger lawyers can learn from.
I think one of them was, and I say this, I'll qualify it. I'm incredibly grateful for where I am in my career right now. And it's one of those things where you look back and it's not a straight line, it's a zigzag. But I started having that itch to go in house probably 5 or 6 years into my law firm practice. I was at a law firm for 11 years, a Chicago firm. And I think I was scared. I think partnership was right in front of me. And I thought, well, I just get there and then I'll figure it out. And so I think one thing I did is I took 4 or 5 years of a 20-year career so far, and I spent it doing something that I think stopped giving me evolution as a lawyer. And I would say I've told people my growth curve as a lawyer was, as a litigator, it was like this. And then I went in house and it went like this, because the volume and the diversity of what you get thrown at you as an in-house lawyer, you don't have a tax expert sitting next to you and a real estate expert sitting next to you. You have to be that person who finds the answer. And so one mistake I've made is I didn't listen to that inner voice early enough. And again, I say that acknowledging how fortunate I am and where I've ended up, and my career has been fantastic. But I would say to lawyers listening, young lawyers, mid of their career lawyers, older lawyers, if you feel like there might be something better, and by that I mean a better fit for you out there, explore it. I'm not saying, blindfold yourself and jump off the deep end, but that is probably one of the things I look back at in my career. And it's not a regret per se, but it is something I wonder about sometimes. What would have happened if I listened to myself and left 5 years sooner?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So take an action when you're supposed to take an action. Do not wait too long. Doing dilly-dally, shilly-shally, negotiating with your own self, negotiating on your values, and fearing too much and not taking actions, because inaction is also a decision.
Absolutely. And it's the easier decision because you're already on a path and change is scary. And I think that's absolutely it. What if I do listen to myself and I'm wrong? Or what if I do listen to myself and I fail? I've built this whole thing here. And so I don't mean to say that my story is universally representative of everybody who's ever taken a career risk in the law. But I do think even if I hadn't been so fortunate to end up in the roles that I'm in with the companies that I'm at, I think I would have been fundamentally happier because I'm doing things that day in and day out are more in line with who I am as a lawyer.
Absolutely. So one of the things similar happened in my life was like, I learned from one of my books that they said, you never make a right or wrong decision. You make a decision and then you make it right or wrong.
I really like that. I've not heard that prior, but I love it.
For example, when I was a partner in a law firm, and we had everything going on right, and I told my wife I'm going to leave this job and start my own law firm, and she's like, "Is it the right decision?" I said, "I don't know if it's right or not, but I will make it right." So you have to make a decision right and make a decision wrong. It's all up, and it's never one decision which will change your life. It's always a series of decisions which will make you right or wrong. So that's one thing I learned. So tell us one habit, Matt, which makes you unusually effective.
I think routine. I am a very routine-based person. Depending on how much is going on in my career and in my life, I tend to grip onto my routine tighter because it gives me a sense of foundation. It's almost like a buoy. But I'm very regimented around, I have a lot of lists for myself and I have workflows with the podcast on which days I post and creation of content. With the book, when I was writing, I would give myself deadlines and say, okay, I'm going to review 5 pages today and 5 pages tomorrow. Because I think if you're sitting down without those parameters in your head, reviewing a 300-page book, it seems like an impossible task. And so if I think about that book as an analogy for life, I don't need to revise the whole book today. I don't need to live my whole life today. I just need to make today the best version of what it can be. And so that involves a lot of things. I try to take care of my body physically. I do a lot of deep stretching. I do some yoga here at home. I have a Peloton bike. I try to be very active and just take care of myself. I'm very thoughtful about what I put into my body. Now, I love Girl Scout cookies. My daughter's a Girl Scout, so I've eaten my share of Girl Scout cookies, but more often than not, it's about being deliberate and thoughtful and finding balance. And so I meditate. I have looked into other forms of meditation. Writing is a form of meditation for me, but I'm probably more programmatic than most people. But I think back to your question at the onset, how do you find time to do all the things that you do? I'm very prescriptive in how I use my time. And so there are times where I say, you know what, not this week. I'm throwing it out the window. I just need to be. I just need to kind of go where the wind takes me. And I find that that gives me, it's almost the equivalent of like a diet, like a cheat week or a cheat day. But I will quickly say, okay, I gave my body and my mind and my aura a sense of freedom to just kind of be a blob, and now back to it. And I pick myself up and I get right back at it. So I think that has been one of the biggest things that I have cultivated in my career. And it's people call that like executive functioning. And it's something that, I think about for my kids specifically and wanting them to understand and to develop early, because the people that I find in my career that have been the most successful are people who have a high degree of executive functioning. And with that comes, I think, deliberate use of your time. And like I said, being regimented, having a process, having a routine.
Absolutely. And I call this habits. What I learned from one of the books was you build habits and the habits build you. So it's about having the routine means having the habit of doing, working on your body, working on your mind, working on this work, having a habit of doing a certain way. So brilliant. Tell us the best piece of advice you ever received, Matt.
So I mean, I could spend the next 5 hours sharing the good advice that I've gotten in my career. I think, as a dad, I'll because it depends on, advice in what realm. When I worked at a law firm, one of the partners, when my son, my oldest, was about a month away from being born, he stopped in my office and he said, "Hey, how's everything going? How's the baby doing?" And I said, "Oh, he'll be here in a month." And I said, "Any advice?" I think he had 5 kids. And I was like, okay, this guy's got to have something. You don't have 5 kids without knowing something. And he said, "Let me tell you, 90% of being a good dad or parent is just showing up, just letting your kids know that you're there." Right. I probably make more mistakes as a dad than in any other part of my life, but I also try harder and I learn lessons and I apologize to my kids. I let them see me as human. I say, "Hey, listen, I screwed up." And so I think my initial reaction to bring that advice up is because I don't think that's just true for being a dad. I think that's true for being a human. Writing a book, hosting a podcast, doing a job, just show up. And by showing up, it's not just physically be there and be on your phone like I was that day at my son's football game, but it's be present, be authentic, be thoughtful. Feel like when you're there, you're putting the best of who you are into that, whether that's a relationship with a child, with a parent, with a sibling, as a lawyer, as a coach. And so I remember as I taught my first class last semester, the first night I was nervous. I thought, "Oh, okay, I'm a pretty good lawyer. I don't know what kind of professor I am." And so I sat down, I had my lesson plan, I opened the book, I said, "Hi, I'm, Professor Campobasso. You guys can call me Matt." And we just went. And I think the success that I had and the feedback was really positive, which I'm grateful for, was because I showed up. And so I think whether you're showing up for the 1,000th soccer practice or football game or track meet, it's just about being there and bringing your best self when you do show up. So I know that sounds a little, it's kind of a soft piece of advice, but it really has served me well. And if you show up, sometimes you're going to realize, "Hey, I'm pretty good at this." Sometimes you're going to realize this isn't for me, but at least you know.
Brilliant. So just show up and be present when you're showing up. Brilliant. That's the best piece of advice you got. What's the worst advice you ever received?
Work harder, work more. Not work harder. I guess that's the wrong way to think of it. Early on in my career, I remember I had a few lawyers who at the time I didn't really know them very well, but they were at my firm and they were just like, "Hey, listen, you're going to be defined by your billable hours. So just if you have the most, as long as you're not committing malpractice, you're going to be the golden boy of this firm or the golden child." And they were right, no doubt about it. Like there were years I billed 2,300 hours and it was, our billable requirement was 2,000. And people were like, "Oh, look at Matt's a cash cow." But that's all I was. And it was at the expense of a lot of other parts of my life. And I think, do the most work. There are times in your career where you're going to have to be working more than other people. That's just the nature of our profession. But that can't be your guiding principle because it's not sustainable. And also at the end of the day, it's not about quantity, it's about quality. And so I think that's probably the worst advice I ever got, which was, if that guy's billing 7 hours or 8 hours and she's billing 9, you have to bill 10. And if you want to be great, you got to bill 11. And that is in a law firm, and people have opinions of law firms and how they're structured. That is probably one of the keys to unlocking success, but it's not long-term sustainable, in my opinion, for building a career. Whether you're going to leave the law firm someday or stay there, because cases fluctuate, matters fluctuate, books of business fluctuate. You want to be good at something. And so it's quality over quantity, in my opinion.
Yes. So it doesn't matter how many hours you put. What matters is what you put in those hours. Uh,
Yes. Yes.
do lawyers in this US law firm slack in the sense they're spending 45 minutes now doing a lot of work with AI, but they're giving a 2 hour bill to the client? Does it? Do you see that happening? Do you feel it's happening?
I mean, I understand the question and the heart of it. I can't say definitively. I always remember one of the partners that told me about billing lots of hours actually said, for every 10 hours that you're in the office, you're probably billing 7. It just, if you're thinking about bathroom breaks and lunch and, phone calls that aren't billable. And I kind of always used that as a rule of thumb. I really respected him. He was actually a great lawyer. As far as, are there lawyers sitting in their office for 10 hours doing 7 hours of work, but billing for 10? I'd imagine probably somewhere. I hope it's incredibly minimal, because that is, to me, tantamount to theft. But it's a hard thing to do. You sit there and you're turning your brain on, and it's kind of equivalent of like riding in a, before we had Ubers and Lyfts, you had taxi cabs and there was a meter running. And so if I sit down at my desk and I'm working on something for 7 minutes as a lawyer, you would bill that as 0.2. But if one of those minutes my brain slipped and I started thinking about my son's football game, then it's 0.1. And so I think because it's human, it happens. I think the distinction is, whether you call that billing creep or billing slip, the distinction is, I think it happens probably more often than not innocently. So there's not like an intent to pad a bill. But I have no doubt that there are lawyers somewhere. Like I said, I hope there's less and less. And maybe with technology evolving the way it is, there's less likelihood for that. But I do think that is probably something that the profession has struggled with.
Yes. So, in my conversation with so many general counsels across so many different companies like Google, Harness, Automation Anywhere, CB Insight, one thing comes up a lot is that, do you think general counsel should stop buying hours and start buying outcomes?
Yes, unquestionably. And I thought, when you asked your last question, I thought that might be where this was going. I've had this conversation before. When I left the law firm that I was with for 11 years, that was a strictly billable hour firm. It was in 2018. The alternative fee structure stuff started being talked about, but lawyers are not great at change. Lawyers like precedent. Lawyers like to look backwards because it gives you that warm, fuzzy feeling of, I know how this is going to turn out. And so I think as a general counsel and as buyers of services, we have a lot more influence to require, hey, you want to work with my company, I want to work with you, but I can't just turn on the meter and have no visibility into what that looks like and then get a bill once a month that I open and hold my breath. That's not a good relationship, especially one that's founded upon the trust of an attorney and a client. It's so sacrosanct that there's a privilege, right? And so that's the part where you're like, oh, what's the bill going to look like? And I still have firms that I work with that do billable hours. I'm very heavy-handed as far as managing counsel because I saw how the sausage was made inside law firms. So I don't deal with much pain there. But there are situations where my last company, Infusion, when we went public, the firm that we used to go public with, we had the first year after our IPO, we had a set fee of SEC guidance and compliance. So they reviewed our filings and things like that because it was a new muscle for us as a company. And so I am a big proponent of that. To your point, I think buying outcomes is absolutely the right focus, the right goal. And buying services like a legal service is, I understand how we got to this point as a profession and how it works the way it does, but I do think that it can be done better. And I think there are certain situations where you'll pay by the hour and it does make sense, but I think we've painted with too broad of a brush that way for too long. And so if I am working with a patent attorney and I say, okay, this is what I want to trademark, I would hope that a patent attorney who does that for a living could look at it and say, okay, this is going to take 6 hours. My rate's $800 an hour. I'll do it for $5,000 or something like that. And then there's a negotiation, and it's you set it and you forget it. And you know, when the bill comes, I've already budgeted for this. And I think the firms and the lawyers that I've seen do this well, the reason they're able to do it well is because they recognize that it's the long-term health of the relationship that matters. It's not a quick cash grab, and that's one of the things with litigation I always found was a challenge, that we did have clients come to us and say, I need a fixed fee. And it's like, well, we don't really know what discovery looks like. We don't know how many depositions we need. And so what we started doing was budgeting for phases. But even then, it was heavily qualified as, well, we think it's going to be $100,000, but if this, and this happen, it might be $1 million. And that's a tough way to carry on a commercial relationship. So I'm all for fixed fees.
Brilliant. Let's talk about IP a bit, because I've spoken to so many people on IP as well. How do GCs view IP versus the CEOs? Why do we have IP?
Can you repeat that question?
How do general counsels view their IP of the company versus the CEOs? Is there a difference between how they view the IP of the company?
I think so. I think CEOs view it as an asset, as kind of a thing that's on a balance sheet somewhere. And hey, if we ever get bought or sold, it helps make the company more valuable. I think lawyers think about it as, I can tell you how I think about it. It's, maybe let's put it this way. I'll step back. A CEO views it as a commodity, like a bar of gold, right? It's there. And I view it as a nest with eggs in it. Because if you don't protect the nest and you don't take the right precautions, yeah, it's there and it's a thing, but it can crack. And once it's cracked and the inside of the egg has leaked, it's kind of worthless, and
Beautiful.
that's why you use trademarks, and that's why you get patents and things like that. So most of my experience has been with soft IP. So, but I absolutely can see how a CEO might say, oh, that's locked and loaded, right? It's there. And as a lawyer, you're like, okay, it's something, but it's delicate and it needs to be protected. So how do we build the right nest around it and let it mature in a way that then we protect it? So that's my non-IP lawyer analogy for IP.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's perfect, because a lot of general counsel feel the same way. General counsels feel that IP is for defensive purposes. They defend your company. They create those moat for you, whereas CEO view them as assets, as you said, the bar, the gold bar.
Yeah.
A lot of let's talk about a bit about AI now, since you have very strong. I've seen your podcast and journeys with other people on your show. So tell us, what keeps you up at night when it comes to AI?
That's a great question. A lot. I think the rapidly expanding and shifting regulatory landscape, no question about that. My current company, Zone, we're global. We have clients around the world. And so you think about the EU Data Act, you think about SEC governance around AI and the usage. Our software at Zone is often used or exclusively used within the NetSuite, Oracle NetSuite platform. And so we offer solutions that amplify or supplement the core NetSuite offering. And our target clients are the office of the CFO, so chief financial officers, chief accounting officers, controllers. And it's about data and visibility. And obviously AI for all of us, and within the context of Zone, it's about insight and analytics and finding efficiencies. And so when I think about that, one of the things that keeps me up at night is when you start thinking about talking with a CFO about treasury management or something like that, you have to be cognizant of the line between data analysis and financial advice, because one is regulated and one is not. And so that's very specific to me, but I think about AI as a solution, as a software, as a amplifier from a functionality perspective. But I also think about it within the context of being a lawyer. And I do think that the rallying cry of AI is going to take all of our jobs is absolutely an exaggeration and an overstatement. And it makes for a good headline. But I think when I stop and I think about this, I think AI, as we mentioned earlier, is a force multiplier. If I use this example a lot with people, if I'm standing in this room and the ceiling is 8 feet tall and there's a light bulb to change, I could run around and get books and boxes and chairs and stack it up and get up there and change the light bulb. And I might get it done, but it's going to take a long time and it's risky and it's wobbly and it's not as efficient as it could be. If somebody comes in and says, hey, here's a 6-foot step ladder, to me, that's AI. It's sturdy, it's predictable, it's efficient. Of course, I'm going to put the ladder down, I'm going to safely climb up, and I'm going to change the light bulb a lot faster and a lot safer. And so the thing that I think people don't think about is, at least where we are right now, AI is not going to change the light bulb for me. It's going to make me more capable of changing 10 light bulbs in the amount of time it would have taken me previously to change one. And so I'm a big proponent of AI, both personally and professionally. I find that it makes me more efficient. I find that it allows me to do more with less. And, we talked earlier about teaching and podcasts and books. The job that I do now in 10 hours without AI, it might take me 13. And so it gives me back time to also think about things proactively. And I was just speaking with a friend about this. A lot of my job as an in-house lawyer is reactive. It's the business comes to me with a question or an issue. And what AI has also allowed me to do is automate some of the repetitive things that the business comes with. And when I have that extra 45 minutes, instead of looking at something and saying, you know what, I got to come back to this later and make it better or build it or build a moat around it if it's an IP issue or something. And now I actually have the time to go back to that thing and proactively smooth that out in a way that doesn't, nobody's cheering me on because I didn't fix something or put out a fire. But to me, that's value. And that's the best value because there's no damage that goes along with it. It's all value.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. So since you're so pro AI and you feel that you are at least 30-40% more efficient with AI, tell us that, do junior lawyers lose opportunity with AI or do they gain leverage? Pick one.
I think they gain leverage.
Okay.
I think if you look at it on the surface, you're thinking, well, now they're
So should they be scared of losing their jobs or no?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think they're going to miss out. I'll tell you this. My first 3 years as a litigator, almost exclusively, I drafted repetitive discovery requests. I answered repetitive discovery requests, and I sat in war rooms reviewing tens of thousands of pages of documents. None of that made me a better lawyer, truly. The things that made me a better lawyer were sitting in a deposition, going and taking a court call, going in front of a judge, sitting third chair in a jury trial. And so we're not at a place where AI is automating any of that stuff away from lawyers. In my experience, yeah, there's going to be less busy work, but truly, I don't think that busy work is additive to helping lawyers advance. And so maybe there's less entry-level legal jobs. I don't know the answer to that, but maybe there are. My thought would be, if you hire 5 associates coming out of law school, instead of burning 15 years having them review documents and look at transcripts, you help them use AI. And what that helps them do is, you still are looking at documents and you're still analyzing them, but AI is sifting through 99% of those documents and transcripts to say, hey, this is irrelevant to you. And so you're getting to the meat, getting to the part of the meal or the experience that has actual protein and value to your growth. And so it will shift the way that law firms are staffed, I believe, but I don't think it's going to be to the detriment of any individual lawyer. I saw today an article that said that IBM had tripled its hiring of junior employees. And the idea is they believe that there's less overhead. And with AI, those lower paid junior employees can do more and reach for higher levels of output that normally they wouldn't be able to until 5 or 6 or 10 years into their journey. So it's changing, but I think it's too soon to tell whether it's all good or all bad. And usually, like most things, I think it'll be a little bit of both.
Absolutely. So it will kill some jobs and generate a lot more work for sure. Just like Industrial Revolution or Green Revolution did for us. We thought everything going to be taken up with Industrial Revolution. We will have no jobs, but we have more work and more things now to do than ever before. And same happened.
apologies for
Yeah,
stepping on you, but more intellectual jobs, right? More using your brain. People aren't
absolutely.
toiling away digging ditches and in farm and in fields, harvesting crops. There's machines that do that now. People are it's scale, and it allows us to do more. And again, like I said, it's probably not going to be all good or all bad. It will change. But to your point, industrial revolution was the end of the workforce. And, you know, we all see how that turned out. So
Absolutely. So if you had to start your career in 2026, Matt, how would you start your career again?
probably the same way that I did. So we
Okay.
haven't spoken about it.
You
I
would not
started
use
my career.
AI, I mean, with career starting and learning all AI tools.
Oh, I apologize. I thought you meant the type of practice. Yeah,
Mm.
I would absolutely grab AI. I likely, knowing myself, if AI had been around when I was in law school, I would have been spending just as much time learning how to utilize that tool as I was learning case law. And I think that, my first job out of law school was as a prosecutor, and my caseload was 200 cases at a time. And so I'd go to court with 40 files and I'd have questions from lawyers. Everything was so manual, but it very, very little of it got us closer to a resolution of the cases I was handling. And
Mm.
so I haven't really stopped to think about that intellectually, what that would have looked like. But no doubt it would have had a significant impact on what my day to day looked like 20
Mm.
years ago.
Mm.
So I would say yes to your question. If you're a law student, a college student, grab AI, learn it, make mistakes, mess around with it, use it for fun things. Just understand how it can act as an extension, how it can be that step ladder that I mentioned earlier.
Mm. Mm. What human skills do you believe, Matt, will be more valuable in next 2 years in AI, in the world of AI?
Critical thinking. And by
Mm.
critical thinking, I believe there's two pieces to that. And I know that can be, anybody who's thinking about critical thought can layer in other perspectives, but it's about data intake
Mm.
and it's about what to do with the output. Because I think if I think about a normal work stream for me 10 years ago, you start here, you end here. And let's say that took 8 hours. The beginning part is gathering information, gathering data, figuring out what's relevant, what's not relevant. The middle part is putting the puzzle together. And now I think we have AI to put the puzzle together. So that's this. So you've got humans here and you've got humans here. And that's a lot less time. And so what I would say is that I think the idea of utilizing AI is good for everyone, no matter what you do. I'm sorry, we could probably cut this. I lost your question. I lost the thread of your question.
So
Can
I
you
said
give me
what
the
human
question?
skills will be
Yeah.
most valuable. You said critical
Yeah.
thinking.
Critical
Yeah.
thought. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry. Um, so I think with critical thought, AI at this point is only as helpful as the prompts. It's the data
Mm.
you put into it. And so you still have to be able to identify relevance, materiality, and prevalence of certain data on, is this something we need to consider here? How important is this? And so
Mm.
every single time I use AI, personally or professionally, I find myself getting a little bit better at refining critically what are the ingredients I need to put into this pot that's going to yield the outcome that I need, or the information that I need, or the conclusion. And then it gives me that back. And then I take it out and I sit down and I look through it and make sure, okay, does this all track with what I would have expected to find? And it's a learning process. But I think critical thought will never, analytical thought, I think, is what AI is doing obviously well for us in many respects. But I differentiate that from critical thought. And I think that's a skill that is going to become more and more important as AI continues to, usage continues to grow.
Hmm. I was about to send a message to advice to a client, and I asked AI. I used Claude a lot. I used Claude. I said,
Mm-hmm.
should I send this message to the client? He said, no, don't send this. This is why you should not send it. And they said, send this inside. I'm like, wow, yeah, he's
Yeah.
improving my critical thinking as well.
Yeah. It's absolutely, AI is like a mentor in
Hmm.
some respects.
Hmm.
Again, you have to be deliberate about, you don't just trust anybody who gives you advice, right? You validate it. How much do I trust this person? How has their advice been in the past? AI is no different. It's a robot. It's a series of algorithms. But to me, to your point, I did something very similar last week. I had an internal email thread that I felt that the employee I was communicating with it wasn't their best work. and I kind of started to write a response challenging some of the assertions, and it was all in the service of a good outcome, in service of a client. But I wrote back, and I was writing it, and I could feel myself a little bit frustrated, and so and I just thought, you know what, I'm going to drop this in AI, and I'm going to say, here's the situation, here's the message I got, here's what I've drafted. Should I send this? And AI was like, the points are there. You should send something, but here's how you can say that in a way that's not going to be as escalatory. It's not going to cause this person to get defensive. And, sure enough, it led to a great outcome, and everything got resolved. But there was a moment there where my emotion, right? One of the things that makes human beings, my emotion was going to get in the way of a good outcome. And I went to AI and said, hey, am I thinking about this the right way? And so absolutely, I think that's a great way. And people think like, oh, rewriting an email, that's such a basic thing. Like, that's stupid. But if you think about, had I sent my first email and that person sent back an escalatory email, and then we're fighting and it's arguing and we've lost the thread of what we're trying to accomplish, that's to the detriment of our business.
Absolutely. And at that time, if you're writing something in huge emotions, you're like writing something, I'm going to teach him a lesson. And then you have this moment of wisdom. You know what? Let me just check with my best AI friend. And he will reflect on this without any emotions, but he will be more into it, give me that advice. Taking the decision of consulting somebody, an AI, that itself is wisdom, which is going to become more critical. That how do we do that? Yes. Absolutely. So coming to the last part of our podcast here, Matthew, if you had to advise a younger Matt who's 28-year-old, what advice would you give him?
As a lawyer or just as a human being?
As a whatever.
As a lawyer, I think I would say, if I had a time machine.
And when you say as a lawyer or as a human being, is lawyer not a human being?
We are, but that's I think sometimes, for a lot of the reasons we've discussed on here, any lawyers who are listening, they probably think like, oh, I have my human side and I have my lawyer side. It's like the Incredible Hulk.
The lawyer and the human side is together. It's not a lawyer side and human side, right?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I didn't appreciate as much, and this is going to be me getting, we're recording this on the February 13th. I don't know when you'll post it, so I want to give your listeners context. Tomorrow's Valentine's Day, right? It's the day of love. I think something that I wish I could emphasize to myself at 28 or 25 is, the concept of love, romantic or otherwise, is something that we as a population, I think, kind of take for granted. And it's secondary to a lot of other things. And I think love goes hand in hand with kindness. I have realized that when I was 28 or 25, I thought to myself, for me to be successful as a human being, I need to make partner. I need to make this much money a year. I need to have a nice car. I need to live in a house that's as big as my friends. I need to go on vacations. And at 47 years old, right now, 20 years later, if I was asked to answer that same question, it would not be none of those things would list. I would say, I want to be remembered for being kind, for loving people the right way, for being trustworthy, for being reliable, for being someone that people felt like I made their lives better. And that's why I asked between lawyer and a human, because as a lawyer, you're giving services, right? No one cares about kindness and love, and those are not things that generally get factored into being a lawyer, unless you're a guardian ad litem and you're dealing with children and there's a level of empathy. But for the most part, I would say that lawyers as a whole are not highly emotional, kind of warm, fuzzy creatures. And so I guess that's why I asked the question. But I would say I wish I had realized 20 years ago the things that matter. And I think I'm glad that I've realized them now. And I've had a lot of amazing people in my life that have helped reveal those things to me. And they've been patient with me as I prioritized other stupid things. And that's not to say that a nice house or a nice car or a good paying job aren't things that make life more enjoyable. But at the end of the day, and this is not an original thought, I'm not going to be laying on my deathbed surrounded by my electric vehicle or my, passport. It's going to be hopefully my children and my partner and people that I love. And that's the stuff that matters at the end. So
Beautiful, beautiful. A younger lawyer or a GC who's watching this show, what's one mistake you would urge them to avoid?
don't take your failures personally.
Failures personally.
Lawyer, don't take them personally because
Okay.
you're going to fail. You're going to make mistakes. And when I made mistakes as a young lawyer, it rocked me at my core. I had a friend in my law firm days, and they used to say, other than like surgeons, for lawyers, it's either you're perfect or you're wrong. And I don't know if that's necessarily true, but it sure sounds good. And I can understand where they were coming from because you feel like there's no margin for error. And so when you do make a mistake as a young lawyer, you don't really show yourself any grace. You think the world's ending, I'm going to get fired, no one's going to respect me, I'm not going to be able to pay my loans, whatever the case may be. And what I've realized is every single time that you make a mistake, and you said it earlier, much better. I can't remember your exact words, but you're not making a bad choice or a bad decision. If something doesn't go to plan, that's an opportunity for me to learn something. And I think when you and I chatted, I think it was last week, I've thought about this a lot. You had mentioned to me, viewing the word no as standing for new opportunities. And, no doesn't necessarily immediately follow a failure, but the question could be like, did I do this well? And if the answer is no, you made a mistake. And if you take that personally and you allow that to erode your value as a lawyer, as a human, you're doing yourself a disservice. Separate the emotional piece of that, the defensiveness, be open to kind of sitting in what you did wrong, learn from it, and then turn around and do it the next time better.
Matt, beautiful conversation today. I really appreciate the way, the authenticity and the naturalness you are telling all these answers. You're writing a book, being a professor, being a father to three beautiful kids, being a beautiful lawyer, transition from a litigator to a general counsel. We learned a lot from you today. Thank you for your time and wisdom and sharing so much with us without filters, with all humbleness. Thank you very much for sharing all with us and our audience here today. Thank you so
Well,
much.
my pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity to chat. Those are some fantastic questions. I have been on a handful of podcasts. I can say, and I'm not blowing smoke, like these were the best questions that I've ever gotten. And so really forced me to reflect. And I think, one thing I'll say is I'm glad we're doing this after I wrote the book, because a lot of the things that I shared with you today, it took me writing that book to realize them. And so had we done this a year ago, who knows, it might have been the worst podcast guest you've ever had. So timing is everything, as they say.
Absolutely. Bill and Matt, glad you could come today.